So, of course, Impact Wrestling Slammiversary is on the horizon. Less than 3 weeks to go until arguably Impact Wrestling's biggest show of the year. And what's fascinating about Impact Wrestling Slammiversary this year is that it kind of mirrors what happened last year. Of course, last year, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a situation where WWE in April, right after WrestleMania aired on the WWE Network, they released a plethora of WWE talent, superstars, employees, furloughed a load of agents as well. There were mass departures from the WWE. This, in turn, actually benefited Impact Wrestling by building up a lot of hype and anticipation because the traditional 90-day non-compete clauses, whenever a talent is released from their contract in WWE, expired just before Slammiversary in 2020. So this led to Impact Wrestling actually building up a big marketing campaign, promotional packages, hyping up Slammiversary 2020 as a sort of new beginning of sorts for Impact Wrestling, teasing a plethora of former WWE superstars and former Impact Wrestling stars to return to the company last year. This included teasers for the likes of Aces and Eights, Super Eric, the Good Brothers, EC3, the list goes on of names that were teased to come into Impact Wrestling. Now, at Slammiversary last year, we did see a plethora of former Impact stars return and new stars debut in Impact Wrestling that had previously been with WWE. And it looks like we're going to see the same this year, of course, because as it was the case last year, right after WrestleMania this year, WWE, due to budget cuts associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, decided to release a plethora of talents once again. They've subsequently done that every single month since then, and the talents that were released in April earlier this year, their 90-day non-complete clauses are set to expire right before Slammiversary once again on the 17th of July. So I thought it would be interesting to do a bit of a retrospective because we have discussed here on the channel at length as to the stars that I think are going to show up in July at Slammiversary, which stars are going to appear, which former Impact stars are going to return, which former WWE superstars are going to debut in Impact Wrestling. But I think it would be interesting to look back on about 12 months ago, look at the names that did return and did debut for Impact Wrestling at Slammiversary last year, and look at what's happened to them over the course of the last 12 months. Where are they now? What was their success like in Impact Wrestling? Are they still competing on the roster? Where are they essentially 12 months later? So let's get first into the names and start off with the Motor City Machine Guns. Now, of course, the Motor City Machine Guns returned to Impact Wrestling in the opening match of Slammiversary last year. It was the open challenge with the Rascals. That was the opening match of Slammiversary 2020. It was an open challenge where they called out any tag team, past, present, future, whatever, they can face us. And it would be the returning Chris Sabin and Alex Shelley, the Motor City Machine Guns, former TNA World Tag Team Champions, one of the greatest tag teams in Impact Wrestling history. Everyone was very excited, and this one had actually been in the plans for a long time. It really had. The turning point for everything, and pun intended, right, with Impact there, but the turning point for everything goes back to last April, around WrestleMania time. There was meant to be this show that Impact Wrestling was going to produce called TNA There's No Place Like Home. And essentially, it was going to be a TNA throwback event. I don't know if Impact Wrestling wanted to do their equivalent of an ECW one-night stand. They've done them occasionally where they do one night only. We're going to go back to TNA wrestling, that kind of stuff. It was going to be like that, but on a bigger scale. We were going to see a King of the Mountain match where Moose was going to win the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. We were going to see an Aces and Eights reunion at that show. Taylor Wilde was going to return at that show. We were going to see a Motor City Machine Guns reunion at that show as well. Alex Shelley had been booked for it. Chris Sabin was returning after, once again, I think it was tearing his ACL on one of his knees. He's done them in both knees, I think, twice over. The fact that he's still wrestling at the standard that he is just frankly incredible. But obviously, because of the pandemic, everything was put on hold. But eventually, the Motor City Machine Guns did return. They won this match. And for a while there in Impact Wrestling, what a run they were having in 2020. It really was spectacular. They returned at Slammiversary. And then the very next show, the very next Impact Wrestling show, this is when it was on Tuesday nights, of course. The very next show, they win the Impact World Tag Team Championships. They defeat the North. They end the North's historic over 1 year reign as Impact World Tag Team Champions. It was crazy. I mean, it really was, considering they just returned and immediately, like that, bang, they were the Impact World Tag Team Champions. Now, eventually, they had feuds with the likes of Ace Austin, Madman Fulton, the Good Brothers, and the North. They eventually lost the Impact World Tag Team Championships at Bound for Glory the following October, in a match that involved all of those tag teams. In actuality, and this is kind of was certainly interesting when it came to it. So before that match, as they're making their entrance, Alex Shelley is attacked, I believe it was by the North. He is attacked on the entrance ramp, and then Chris Sabin has to go it alone. But eventually, the North end up pinning, I think it was Carl Anderson. They actually end up winning the tag team championships, and the Motor City Machine Guns haven't won it back since. Now, towards the end of the year, the reason at the time was given that actually Alex Shelley was dealing with an injury at the time. I think he might have been dealing with a neck injury or something like that. So that was the reason as to why he was taken out of the match at Bound for Glory. That's why he was written off of TV for a period of time, if you will. But that was essentially the reason. That was the reason there. Now, eventually, Alex Shelley did return, and the plan was, of course, for him to be teaming with Chris Sabin and Rich Swann as they took on the AEW World Champion Kenny Omega and the Good Brothers at Hard to Kill in January of this year. But just days before the Hard to Kill pay-per-view in January, Alex Shelley was forced to pull out of Impact Wrestling Hard to Kill. Now, at the time, the only reasons we were given as fans and as people on social media, the only reasons we were given is that it was unforeseen circumstances that he just couldn't get out of and he just couldn't avoid. Now, he later released a message on his social media where essentially he said, look, I'm a frontline care worker. I've been working throughout the entirety of the pandemic. I don't have a contract with Impact Wrestling. It's a handshake deal. It's a per appearance kind of deal. I don't have a deal. I don't have a contract. They asked me to come to these tapings. I say yes. If I can, I go. If I can't, I can't. And essentially, where Alex Shelley works as a frontline care worker, essentially they changed their policy when it came to COVID-19 and vaccinations, etc., and that he couldn't go somewhere, or the company couldn't permit him to go somewhere where people weren't vaccinated. He had to go somewhere where everyone was vaccinated. He even said that himself, that he wasn't keen on getting the vaccination, which I think was a bit of an eye-opener for me, certainly. But he said that he got it anyway because of his job, but he wasn't allowed to go to a place where everyone wasn't vaccinated. So the door is open for him to return to Impact Wrestling in the future. But since then, we haven't seen Alex Shelley. We haven't seen Alex Shelley on Impact Wrestling television since January, really. And that was because all of those episodes were taped right at the end of last year. They basically did a huge amount of taping in November that carried Impact all the way through December and all the way through January. So in reality, Alex Shelley hasn't actually appeared inside the Impact Zone or to do shooting or to do footage for Impact Wrestling since November last year. So if you look at it, he wasn't around for a huge period of time. 3-4 months, something like that. Not a huge period of time at all. And I guess the hope is, and I guess the desire is, that eventually he will return. I think he probably will. I think as we're getting towards, getting to a point, fans are returning for this upcoming episode of coming pay-per-view of Slammiversary later on next month in July. And given the fact that, it depends which states they're getting into, but if they can ensure, I guess, that Alex Shelley is going into a company where everyone is vaccinated, that might lead to his return. Ultimately, I do think Alex Shelley will return, but it's difficult. It's difficult, obviously, with the pandemic and all that kind of stuff. It makes it a very difficult kind of scenario for him to return. Ultimately, he wants to. I think every Impact Wrestling fan wants to see the Motor City Machine Guns return. I think that if Alex Shelley was able to return right now, I do think they would have done a Motor City Machine Guns versus Young Bucks match, probably at this year's Slammiversary event. That doesn't look like, obviously, it's going to happen. Chris Sabin right now is scheduled to face Moose. I still do think the Young Bucks want that match to happen. I'm sure that Chris Sabin and Alex Shelley both want that match to happen. The issue is, as I mentioned, is that Alex Shelley does have other work commitments. They've always been his first priority. Wrestling's kind of been his weekend gig, his side gig, whereas he's got his full-time 9-to-5 job. So look, time will tell. Time will tell what happens when it comes to Alex Shelley's return. I hope it does. But it's interesting looking back in retrospect. This is why I think videos like this are fun to do, given that how much excitement was there for the Motor City Machine Guns, one of the greatest Impact tag teams in history, to return. And in reality, they weren't actually around for that long. It felt a lot longer, obviously, because they were scheduled to team up in January of earlier this year. But in reality, it was only from July really to November. And then obviously these issues started to start. And Alex Shelley even couldn't compete since October because of an injury that he suffered. So unfortunate, but I do think hopefully eventually Alex Shelley will return. Speaking of returns, Heath, the former WWE Superstar Heath, made his debut last year at Slammiversary for Impact Wrestling. Heath was, again, one of those names that was released by WWE in April due to budget cuts associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, Heath, during the Slammiversary broadcast, this is when it was Josh Matthews and Don Callis on commentary for the show. They're doing an on-camera presentation. They're hyping up the card. They're talking through the show. And suddenly, Heath jumps the barricade and found his way into Skyway Studios in Nashville, Tennessee, and proclaimed that he was there in Impact Wrestling. And he was there, and he was going to stick around in Impact Wrestling. Now, the storyline for Heath, and this was going all the way to Bound for Glory in October was that Heath was a free agent and he was looking to be signed by Impact Wrestling. Now, of course, in reality, Heath had signed a contract with Impact Wrestling, but the storyline was going that he was going to be a free agent. Now, I did quite a few videos on this at the time that I wasn't a massive fan of the story and the gimmick. I'll be totally honest with you. The reason I wasn't a massive fan of the story and the gimmick is that I felt that Heath could do more. I felt that Heath could do something bigger. We saw, obviously, Heath Slater in WWE. For the majority of his career post-Nexus, he was a comedy guy. He was a comedy gimmick. He was low down on the card, whether it's 3MB, Social Outcast, whatever. He was a comedy guy. And he did have some success, of course, when he was teaming up with Rhino, right? When the 2016 WWE brand extension, the WWE draft, he was an unassigned superstar, and he was a free agent there and was going from brand to brand, trying to get signed, trying to get a contract. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, it certainly does. But once Heath was released by WWE, he was one of those names I looked at in April last year where I said, this is the best thing for him because he is capable of so much more. And he has been around. He was with WWE. He was signed in something crazy like 2006. And honestly, and he was in developmental for a long time and eventually he gets called up as part of NXT Season 1 and then the Nexus, etc. And there was so much potential that he could do. And we saw that when he appeared on an episode of Raw last summer, right? After he was released, he was in a segment on Raw with Dolph Ziggler and Drew McIntyre, and he cut one of the promos of the year last year where he was dead straight looking in Drew McIntyre's face, saying, you were meant to be my friend, you were meant to help me. I've got kids that are at home crying, asking me if we're going to get kicked out of the house, if we can afford where we live anymore, if we can afford to pay rent, if we can afford to put food on the table. I can't do that. Where were you to help me? Where were you? I was there for you because his last appearance was on the bump. He said, my last appearance, I was celebrating your title victory. Where were you for me? Nowhere. And he has a match with Drew McIntyre. He gets beaten in about 30 seconds because he's not a contracted talent. So why would WWE even try to elevate this guy? Reportedly, they did make him an offer to come back, and he said no. He said no after that. He felt that this was the right move for him, and he wanted to leave. But when I saw that promo on Raw last year, I went, man, this guy, he really can be a big deal in a company like Impact. He can be a world champion. He can be great. So when he showed up at Slammiversary, I was very excited, but then I was slightly, I don't want to say disappointed, but I was a little bit like, oh, when I saw that they were doing the same gimmick with him that he had done in 2016 when he was an unassigned free agent and he was going back and forth from Monday Night Raw trying to win a contract. He was doing the same with Impact Wrestling. He was being a comedy guy, and that's what he did. He reunited with Rhino backstage. Of course, they were former SmackDown Tag Team Champions, and then he kept having this thing where Scott D'Amore said, "Look, we don't have the budget. We don't have the budget. We don't have the head count to offer you a contract here. I'm sorry, you're not going to get an opportunity." And they had opportunities that they didn't get. And then eventually it all came down to the Call Your Shot Gauntlet at Bound for Glory, in which obviously if you win that match, you get the Call Your Shot Gauntlet trophy and you get yourself a future championship opportunity. But this was the situation that if Heath Slater won, or Heath won that match, he would earn himself a contract with Impact Wrestling. Rhino also stipulated that if Heath didn't win or Rhino didn't win, then Rhino would be fired as well. So not only was he putting that on the line for Heath, but he was putting his career on the line. Unfortunately, mere moments of entering that match in October last year, Heath came in, maybe did a couple of clotheslines, did a kick, and then basically just tore the entirety of his side. He had about 3 hernias. I think he might have even tore his groin off his pelvis or tendons off his pelvis. I mean, it's horrible, horrible injury. And to the point where the plan for that match was for Heath to win that match. And it was so bad, not only could Heath not stand up, they had to call an audible. Referees were scrambling at ringside, talking to Rhino, talking to Heath. I think talking to Sami Callihan was in that match as well, trying to figure out what to do, essentially. And the audible was made to throw Heath over the top rope, eliminate him, and actually have Rhino win the match by last beating Sami Callihan. That was the revised plan on the spot there. And then Heath subsequently, the injury was revealed to be quite serious, and he needed to get surgery. The issue is that Heath had that injury, sustained that injury in October, Bound for Glory in October. The problem was Heath hasn't been able to get surgery, or wasn't able to get surgery until March of this year. And obviously people would look at that and say, wait a minute, it took him 5 months to get surgery on an injury he sustained in October. Why did it take that long? In reality, it took so long because his injuries were so severe that Heath wanted to spend as little time possible on the shelf, because he essentially needed 3 separate surgeries for 3 separate injuries. And it took him a long, long time to find a doctor that would be willing to do all 3 surgeries at once, essentially. Now, he did get it done. He's currently rehabbing. As to when he's going to be back, time will only tell. He was written off of television, I think, in November after Violent by Design, a faction headed up by another returning guy who we'll talk about in a second, attacked him at an Impact TV taping. But as far as when Heath is going to return, we don't know. It's probably going to be at some point this year. I would suspect sometime in the fall. I wouldn't suspect to see Heath back at Slammiversary. I think that's too soon. But he could make a quick recovery. Time will only tell. Obviously, he has an issue now with his former tag team partner because Rhino, who, again, won that Call Your Shot gauntlet, actually cashed it in for Violent by Design, and now he's turned heel whilst Heath is still a babyface. Again, I really did feel that there was opportunities for Heath, and I still do, but I just don't want to see the comedic Heath anymore. I wasn't a massive fan of Heath coming in and then rehashing a gimmick that he did in WWE like 4 years prior. So him coming back, him not being with Rhino, I mean, I wasn't opposed to the Rhino-Heath tag team. I thought there was something there, especially if one turns on the other, which it looks like they kind of have now. I would have been, I'm open to that, but I wasn't open to, again, the rehashing of the gimmick. And it sucks about Heath, you know, he gets this big opportunity and suddenly he gets injured. It sucked. It absolutely sucked. And it was the payoff of a storyline that they'd spent months building to, even if I wasn't a fan of it myself. It was the payoff of a storyline that they then couldn't do because of the injury. And it took him so long to get the surgery as well. So it's been a real string of bad luck for Heath, but here's hoping that when he does return later on this year, he can really go up the card, because I do think there's possibilities there. I really do think there's possibilities for Heath. Like I said, he just had some real unfortunate luck, and it really does suck. It really does suck for him. Now, I mentioned him there, Eric Young. Eric Young also returned in the main event of Slammiversary. Now, going into Slammiversary, it was going to be a fatal four-way match for the vacant Impact World Championship. Remember, the title was vacant because Tessa Blanchard was the world champion, and then it was vacated because she left the company. Her contract was expiring, and she refused to go to Impact TV tapings. She was stranded in Mexico. There was all of that drama. There was so much drama going on into Slammiversary last year. So we were having a fatal four-way match, which was Trey Miguel, Ace Austin, Eddie Edwards, and a mystery fourth person. Now, one of the returns, technically, that show, he's not on the list, but you can kind of see him in the background there, was Rich Swann. It was later revealed that Rich Swann was the mystery fourth person. He had been out with a broken ankle/leg, or possibly career-ending injury, and he had returned, and it was revealed to be Rich Swann. And everyone was like, oh, Rich Swann, okay. Thought it was going to be a WWE superstar, former WWE superstar, but it turned out to be Rich Swann. As they're just setting up for the match to begin with all four guys in the ring, suddenly Eric Young's music hits, and out comes the former Impact World Champion and former WWE superstar who had returned to the company that made him famous. And Eric Young's story is just fascinating. Eric Young's story is just fascinating since he returned to Impact, because I'll be totally honest here, and I think a lot of people would probably agree with this, because of how badly Eric Young was booked and treated in WWE, Eric Young was coming into Impact Wrestling with zero momentum. So much so that he came out, and I think people went, oh, okay, Eric Young's back, whatever. People didn't care. They just didn't care, because, and that's no disrespect to Eric Young, but that's a testament to how badly he was booked in WWE, because for the last 2 years that he was in WWE, he did nothing. I mean, and not just like nothing of, oh, I was on the shows. He did nothing, absolutely nothing. I think one of his last appearances was on an edition of Raw where he didn't even get an entrance. He lost in about 30 seconds. I can't even remember who to. He might have appeared on some episodes of Main Event, but he did nothing. And any sense of importance that he once had of being a former Impact World Champion, being a former NXT Tag Team Champion, or being a big faction in NXT, I mean, he was appearing in War Games. The first War Games match with Sanity, right? He was a big deal. And they had just done nothing with him. So he felt he had zero importance coming into Impact Wrestling when he returned last year. And in about 10 minutes, he turned zero importance into being one of the biggest heels on the roster. It was that quick. He attacked Rich Swann. He attacked his injured ankle, smashed it up. He was eliminated by Rich Swann first, and then he attacked the ankle, threatened to, I guess, send Rich Swann back into retirement. He had a wide-eyed look on his face, and then he was off to the races. He was the world-class maniac, and Rich Swann was forced to retire because of the attack. And Rich Swann did an incredible retirement speech on Impact Wrestling, surrounded the ring with all of the Impact talent. Eric Young once again attacked him, and he just got so over. He got so over as a heel. He was one of the top heels, arguably in the business. I know people will roll their eyes at it, but it's true. He's certainly the top heel in Impact Wrestling. And again, this was coming in after having no momentum from WWE. Got himself over, world-class maniac, Violent by Design. He was already using that stuff at the start. He got himself so over to the point that I think they altered Bound for Glory plans. The plan at one point last year for the main event of Bound for Glory was to have Eddie Edwards versus Ken Shamrock for the Impact World Championship. That was the plan. the Eric Young character and the Eric Young and Rich Swann feud got over so much, they switched the title pretty quickly into Eddie Edwards winning the World Championship. Only a few weeks afterwards, they switched the World title. Eric Young wins the Impact World Championship, and then they transition to an Eric Young versus Rich Swann Bound for Glory main event. In reality, as well, as I mentioned, Eric Young's coming off of no momentum from WWE. In the matter of weeks, he's the world champion. Again, that's a testament to the work that he did. He was just on fire. Now, he lost the championship to Rich Swann at Bound for Glory, and subsequently, he's since gone on to form the Violent by Design faction with the likes of Joe Doring, Dina, and Rhino. Of course, Violent by Design are the Impact Tag Team Champions. Unfortunately for Eric Young, and I guess it's a bit of a recurring theme here, because we say Alex Shelley on the shelf who can't compete, Heath on the shelf can't compete. Eric Young, at the moment, he's on the shelf and he can't compete. He tore his ACL. He's going to be out for something like 9 months or something crazy. He's hoping to get back sooner than later, but he is on the shelf at the moment. Now, he's still on Impact Wrestling television every single week. Just because he's got an injury doesn't mean he can't cut promos, doesn't mean he can't be the mouthpiece for Violent by Design. So he's still got Joe Doring, Dina, and Rhino to do all the matches, but ultimately he, of course, would like to be wrestling, but he can't. He can't because he's got the torn ACL, which is incredibly frustrating for him, considering, again, he was on one of the biggest roles of his career, and certainly in the last few years, coming off of just having no momentum in WWE, comes back, wins the World Championship, has a big faction, and then he gets injured. It sucks. It really does suck. Again, the prognosis of when he returns, earliest would be the end of the year. I don't know if I see that. I probably see early 2022 as to when he returns. But he can still be on TV every single week, and I think that's the important thing. Eric Young is a very good promo. Obviously, he's got a very distinctive voice himself. So I think he's still doing a very good job. Obviously, he did excellent coming right out of the gate, coming out of Slammiversary last year, but he's fallen to the curse, I guess, of getting an injury. But I think he's doing an excellent job. Even with the injury, he's still Violent by Design and one of the high points on Impact Wrestling right now. I think the faction is money, and I think there's more names to be added. So I think Eric Young has just been a huge success story since returning to Impact Wrestling last year at Slammiversary. Now, these two guys, one made their debut, one made a return to Impact Wrestling. Of course, Doc Gallows was previously, got the name Doc, being in Impact Wrestling way back when. Kyle Anderson, though, made his debut for Impact Wrestling when they made their return/debut, whatever you want to call it, at Slammiversary last year. Now, the announcement was made about the Good Brothers signing with Impact Wrestling 24 hours, well, it was, yeah, I guess it was not really 24 hours. It was made at midnight, the night of Slammiversary. It was an unusual way to do it. Basically, the reports and rumors about the Good Brothers signing with Impact Wrestling had leaked out a while before, a couple of weeks before, something like that. There was the discussions that they were basically coming into Impact. They'd just yet to sign on the dotted line. Then a couple of days later, it was they've signed on the dotted line, so everything was crossed. They were coming in to Impact Wrestling. And then once the clock struck midnight, for Slammiversary last year, for the date on Saturday, then Impact Wrestling posted it to their Twitter feed that the Good Brothers had officially signed. It was a video of Kyle Anderson and Doc Gallows appearing inside the Impact Zone, and the announcement was made that they'd signed multi-year deals, 2-year deals with Impact Wrestling. Now, they weren't scheduled for the show, they weren't scheduled for a match or anything like that, but once the main event had finished, in which Eddie Edwards had become the Impact World Champion for the second time, he had last pinned Ace Austin, out came Madman Fulton and Ace Austin. They attacked Eddie Edwards, and then the Good Brothers came out to make the save. I found it's still hilarious to this day that the Good Brothers come out, it's their big debut in Impact Wrestling. Big stars, obviously they were with WWE on big contracts, big New Japan stars. They were with AJ Styles. They were in the main event of WrestleMania Night 1 in that Boneyard match of AJ Styles and The Undertaker. Kyle Anderson and Doc Gallows, they were in that match. They were in that match and they were only released a couple of weeks later. So big deal for Impact Wrestling. Big debut. Walking down the ramp, Doc Gallows nearly slips over. It's still funny. It's still totally hilarious. But they come out, they make the save, and they stand tall with Eddie Edwards to close the show. What's happened with them in the last 12 months? What hasn't happened with them in the last 12 months? So initially, they went into a feud with Ace Austin and Madman Fulton as baby faces. They didn't win the Impact World Tag Team Championships for a while, actually. It's Bound for Glory, as I mentioned earlier on in the video. They were pinned. I think it was Kyle Anderson was pinned by, I believe, Ethan Page for the North to become the 2-time Impact Tag Team Champions. But eventually, they did win those Impact Tag titles the following month at Turning Point. They held them all the way until Impact Sacrifice, when they lost them to New Japan Pro Wrestling's FinJuice. Now, during that period of time, it must be stated as well, Impact Wrestling and AEW established a working relationship, and the Good Brothers turned heel during that period of time. They turned heel and they rejoined Kenny Omega and the Elite. They aligned themselves with Don Callis, with Kenny Omega, and they've begun making regular appearances on AEW Dynamite as well. In addition to that, they've just been announced that they're going to be returning to New Japan Pro Wrestling. They're going to be appearing for New Japan Pro Wrestling on their New Japan Strong show. So at the moment, they're working for Impact, for AEW, for New Japan Pro Wrestling. The only weird thing I would say from an Impact side of things is they never win anymore. Never win it anymore. They never win matches. As I mentioned, they lost an Impact Sacrifice to Finn Juice in a very surprising match that they lost the Impact World Tag Team titles. I don't think anyone saw that coming because obviously Finn Juice were a New Japan Tag Team. They lost the titles to them, and then I think the expectation was, well, they'll win it back at Rebellion. Rebellion was a big event. It was that title versus title main event. They'll win it back. And then the closing moments of that show, we'll see, you know, the Good Brothers and Kenny Omega standing tall with all the belts. That makes a lot of sense, right? No, they didn't. They lost once again to Finn Juice at that event. Then we have Impact Under Siege. It's a 6-man tag team match in which it's they're teaming with Kenny Omega against Eddie Edwards and Finn Juice. They lost again. Kyle Anderson ate a pinfall. Obviously, we had Against All Odds a couple of weeks ago. It was starting off the show was a street fight tag team match. Sami Callihan and Tommy Dreamer versus the Good Brothers. You can have a guess who won that match. It wasn't the Good Brothers. Sami Callihan and Tommy Dreamer won. Kyle Anderson ate a pinfall again. So their record for these big stars that probably are on probably the two or close to these two biggest contracts in Impact Wrestling right now, their record is awful, especially in 2021. They just never stop losing. All they do is lose matches, big pay-per-view matches. It's surprising, but they're still very big assets to Impact Wrestling. And now, as of about right now, they have about a year left on their deals because they signed 2-year deals. Obviously, the options was always in their contract to work with New Japan. I expect them to expand on that over the course of the next 12 months, possibly going back to Japan. I know it's very difficult at the moment given the outbreak over there. Obviously, they're going to continue working with AEW as well with the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega and Don Callis, but they've still got their Impact Wrestling commitments as well. As far as when are they going to win the Impact World Tag Team titles next, I have no idea. I genuinely have no idea. The reason I say I have no idea is because from an Impact Wrestling perspective right now, they have like zero momentum because all they've done is lose. They are nowhere near the Impact Tag Team Championships. Violent by Design currently hold the belts. They're heels as well, so I don't think the Good Brothers face off against them anyway. So it's surprising. It's surprising considering they are such big names and they were booked so strong from the outset, but they do a lot of jobs right now, which again is kind of strange, almost. And again, I might be wrong here, but it's almost kind of a feeling like even 12 months out from their contract expiring, even though they know the Good Brothers contract expires around this time next year, it's almost like Impact knows they're not going to re-sign. So we just got to try and get them to put over as many talents as possible. I don't know. It's very, their booking, especially in 2021, has been surprising, but I guess maybe the thought process is that they're over no matter what. It doesn't matter if they lose matches because they're the Good Brothers. They're still two of the biggest stars we have in Impact Wrestling, right? And I guess maybe that's the mentality that some of the Impact Wrestling officials have. I don't know. It certainly is surprising, but look, they've done a whole hell of a lot over the course of the last 12 months. They're appearing for 3 different companies right now. I wouldn't even rule them out of winning the AEW World Tag Team titles at some point. I know the Young Bucks are currently the tag champions, but you can't rule anything out with the Good Brothers. And they are all over the place, even though their booking and Impact is slightly confusing. They've certainly been a big success for Impact Wrestling. There's no doubt about that. Finally, to close out Slammiversary last year, we saw EC3 make his return, kind of, to Impact Wrestling. The EC3 Ethan Carter III story with Impact last year, I found baffling. I really did find it baffling. So after the Good Brothers were standing tall with Eddie Edwards last year as he's holding up the Impact World Championship, we then saw this image of EC3 as the show closed. It was the closing shot of the show was EC3. I think he threw a glass at the screen and that was it. And everyone was very, very excited because I think to be honest, all the names that were released last year by WWE in April, a lot of people, especially from an Impact perspective, were really excited about seeing EC3 return because his story in WWE was, again, terrible. This was a guy who had, moderate success in NXT. He wasn't even there long enough, really, to have a ton of success. comes to the main roster and then just, I mean, buried to all hell. And people were so disappointed because, of course, this was the second time he was in WWE. Previously, he was Derek Bateman, and he never got an opportunity with that. But since leaving WWE, he had gotten himself so over in Impact Wrestling. He really had become a staple of Impact Wrestling for several years. First as Dixie Carter's nephew, and then just being Ethan Carter III, and being a former Impact World Champion. He retired Sting. I think he might have retired. Did he retire Kurt Angle out of Impact Wrestling as well? I mean, this was a huge name in sort of more modern Impact Wrestling history. So people were very excited to see him come back and excited to see him be, Ethan Carter III again and be a world champion, because he's a world champion caliber competitor in Impact Wrestling. People were so excited to see someone with all of that history come back to Impact. So seeing him at the end of Slammiversary, people were very, very excited. But his story, I was just not a fan. I just was not a fan of how everything turned out. So in reality, it would appear that he signed a very short-term deal with Impact Wrestling. He signed a deal where basically, I don't even know if he was under contract. He signed a deal whereby he would work from Slammiversary to Bound for Glory, and that was it. And the story that they played out with is that Moose was the TNA World Heavyweight Champion at the time. I think EC3 actually appeared inside the Impact Zone at the following episode of Impact Wrestling, attacked Moose, eventually stole the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, and then realistically, that was it. Every single week on Impact Wrestling, we either saw a promo in a room by EC3 like this, or we saw Moose and EC3 confront each other in, a pre-taped vignette outside of the Impact Zone or somewhere else. And eventually this led to a cinematic match at Bound for Glory between EC3 and Moose, in which Moose won, if you can call it that. I don't even know if you can call it a match. It was more of a segment. And Moose has his TNA World Heavyweight Championship, and EC3 tells Moose that you can now control your narrative. Now you control your narrative. It was all about teaching Moose a lesson, teaching Moose to liberate himself or something, something like that. And the one positive, I suppose, out of all of that was that it did elevate Moose. It did make Moose feel like a bigger deal. Moose, I mean, I say beating again because it wasn't a match. It just wasn't. But Moose winning against EC3 did make him feel like a bigger deal. But even now, what did that lead to when it comes to Moose? Because Moose didn't win the Impact World Championship. He lost the unification match to Rich Swann, and he just lost to Kenny Omega. He did eventually re-sign with Impact, but whilst it did elevate Moose in the grand scheme of things, did it get him over to the point of winning a world championship? No, it didn't. For EC3, he has subsequently revealed, he spoke about this, that the plan was to actually have a match inside the Impact Zone between Moose and EC3 at Bound for Glory. Impact Wrestling officials decided they didn't want that. They wanted to go in a different direction. They wanted to have the cinematic match. So they did the cinematic match. So I don't necessarily blame EC3 for that. I blame the Impact officials for that, because it just wasn't the right move. It just wasn't the right move. I would have much preferred to see EC3 versus Moose inside of the ring at Bound for Glory. I think a lot of people would. I thought that's what they were saving it all for. I thought the whole point is that we've only seen EC3 inside of the Impact Wrestling ring once. That's for a reason, right? That's by design, so that we have his first match inside of an Impact Wrestling ring at Bound for Glory, the biggest event of the year for Impact Wrestling, their WrestleMania, their Starrcade, their whatever. I thought, okay, that makes sense. But then to have it in a cinematic match and that being the end of EC3's run, it just didn't make any sense whatsoever. It really didn't. And we haven't seen EC3 in Impact Wrestling since. Since then, he made appearances for Ring of Honor. He signed with Ring of Honor. Subsequently went down with, I believe, a staph infection. He was in hospital for quite a period of time. I don't know if he's actually returned yet. I think he's meant to return. Is it Final Battle or something like that? But he is scheduled to return at some point this year, but he was out of action for a while. Again, the Slammiversary bug continues, or the Slammiversary curse continues. Just looking back on it, that's the one name of the returns last year that I was most disappointed by, and that's not just in retrospect and reflecting on it. Obviously, still now I'm still disappointed by it, because I thought it could have been so much more. But even at the time, you can see the videos on the channel where I was a bit like, I don't know why they're doing this. I didn't like the match at Bound for Glory. I thought it was too overly complicated. I thought they were trying to be too subtle and try and tell certain messages. Oh, this is meant to be this is meant to be interpreted as this, and this is meant to be this, and eventually you control your narrative. It was silly. It was overly complex, and I just didn't get it. Again, the whole storyline I felt was a waste. I thought if you've got these appearances for EC3, use them. Have him inside the Impact Zone. Have him inside of an Impact Wrestling ring. I'm not saying you have to waste his matches on free television. That's fine. If you want to just build to one match versus Moose at Bound for Glory, do that, but have it inside the ring. Make the pay-per-view mean something. I think a lot of people came out of that match with EC3 and Moose, that cinematic presentation, and just went, No, that was a miss. That was a miss. And that's a shame. Again, considering that arguably EC3 was the name that people were the most excited about, that's a shame. Because it could have meant so much more. It could have been so much more. But it felt like... It didn't feel like the EC3 that Impact fans had grown accustomed to. And again, that's not a bad thing. I'm always saying characters should evolve. It could have been better, and it could have been so much more. And, you know, who knows? Eventually, maybe EC3 will come back to Impact Wrestling once again, but time will only tell with that. But with all of these, it's certainly interesting to look at this in perspective and in retrospect, rather, and see where these guys are now. It's fascinating. But look, guys, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on the Slammiversary 2020 Impact Wrestling returns and debuts, where they are now? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys, talking about Impact Wrestling, AEW, WWE, New Japan Pro Wrestling, all things pro wrestling here on the channel. So be sure to get involved in the community, drop a comment below. All opinions are welcome. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button too. Really does help us out here on YouTube. Go up the rankings and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestling News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right corner of the screen right now. Or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or have you come across this video today. And I'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.